presenter is, where are we? Our next presenter needs no introduction. A regional public servant for over a decade, Nadar spent his formative years in trade facilitation and biosecurity with the Secretariat of the Pacific Community in Suva, as it was known then, before joining a New Zealand MPI in the early 2000s. Nadar is a specialist advisor, Pacific Imports, Horticulture Imports, Animal and Plant Health Directorate with the Biosecurity New Zealand with the Ministry of Primary Industries. Nadar will be joined this afternoon by his colleague Alipate Camaivuna, beg your pardon, who will speak to food safety under the Food Act 2014, New Zealand's Food Act. Gentlemen, welcome. I very much appreciate MPI's support towards and coming alongside Pacific Trade Invest New Zealand to join us this afternoon on this webinar. Many of you online would have heard previous presentations by MPI, but I think you'll agree with me that this afternoon's presentation is a little bit more detailed, a bit more focused, intentionally so, and we certainly look forward and welcome you both. So over to you, Nadar and Alipate. Naka.
Naka. Kia ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, ni Sambula Vinaka, Madam Trade Commissioner and the PTI New Zealand. Thank you for the invite again, and also thank you for the kind words of welcome. As you've alluded to, I have my colleague, Mr. Alipate Camaivuna, who will also be presenting. So I'll be covering the biosecurity component of the presentation, and Mr. Camaivuna will join me and will present on the food safety component of the presentation. Thank you, Ivy. Before I start, I also would like to acknowledge our partnership with PETI, Madam Trade Commissioner and the team, and we thank you for your support, and we look forward to our continued engagement and participation in helping the Pacific Island countries. We, MPI, we were requested to present on both the food safety as well as the biosecurity. Usually our US, the importers and exporters, our traders, most of the time you don't really understand why requirements change. Sometimes it gets annoying and frustrating trying to meet the requirements that are stipulated by the importing countries, in this case New Zealand, and that is done through the regulatory authority. With biosecurity and food safety, it's the New Zealand Ministry for Primary Industries. So I thought I'll just mention at this point that with biosecurity and food safety being regulated on the ground here in New Zealand, above that sits the international, in the international space, we have the usually referred to as the Three Sisters, the Codex. They set the international standards for food safety. The International Plant Protection Convention, they set the international standard for plant and plant products for consumption. And we also have the OIE, they set the international standards for animal and animal health in terms of that space. So the Three Sisters, they are the sisters that engage at the international level purely to develop international standards to protect the countries so that contracting parties and members are able to protect their countries. And secondly is to be able to facilitate safe trade whenever those commodities under those respective international bodies are traded. With the biosecurity, the New Zealand MPI, our strategy with New Zealand's consideration of the importance of us protecting of our life into the future. Our primary needs must thrive. Our primary sector, our natural environment must be protected, and the food that we also consume must be safe. With that in mind, MPI's new strategy provides focused need to make change or take opportunities with regards to advancing our vision. And our vision, New Zealand will be the most sustainable provider of high-value food and primary products. For us to be able to provide high-valued food and primary products, we should be able to also protect New Zealand from biosecurity risks, from food safety issues and risks that could also be introduced into New Zealand that would then hinder the vision or MPI's vision in providing that. Next slide, please. With MPI, we have MPI has 5 business units. We have the food safety component. We also have the fisheries, and we have the biosecurity in New Zealand. We also have our forestry service, and as well as our investment services. That is how we operate as a ministry, as a regulatory authority here in New Zealand. Next slide, please. So the component that I'll be presenting on, as I've alluded to earlier on, is on biosecurity. So it'll be around fresh produce, floriculture, cut flowers. So for those who have been exporting to New Zealand, they know and they understand this process. For those of us who are new and would like to also, would like to also in the future export to New Zealand, these are some of the processes that we follow. And the number one process is the request for an access for a particular commodity, for example, banana, is sent by the exporting country, could be Samoa, could be Fiji, to New Zealand MPI. And there are 2 key words: prioritized and market-driven. And both these, I would say, principles, we have not really done well in the Pacific in terms of meeting these 2 principles. Most of the commodities that have been requested in the past have been requested to New Zealand MPI without any link to the market demand, without any link to how that commodity performs in the market. It is out of nowhere. In the past, maybe because of the political influence, a grower who may be related to someone in authority who then pursues that request, but then when the request was approved, trade has not resulted as a result of that. So having those requests to be prioritized, that is one of the key messages that we're pushing back to the country, for them to be able to have some sort of prioritization process, prioritize your commodities, and making sure that the prioritization also includes linking with the market, make sure that there is a market demand, make sure that there is a slot for the commodity at the market, and there are interested consumers who are interested for that commodity. It has to be market driven. So this is the shift. We're wanting to shift this approach. In the past as well, most of our growers, they go ahead and engage the whole village, and they plant a whole orchard of taro, maybe, or cassava, and then when it's mature, then they start running around looking for the market. By the time they secure the market, half of the crop is gone because of the cousins in the village. They come and they harvest, or pest and diseases, because it's maturing on the ground. So by the time you're ready to sell the produce, it's not the tonnage that you anticipated in the beginning to sell to the market. So it's a complete shift in prioritization and making sure that it's always market driven. We prioritize the request once that's received by MPI, and we have our prioritization process here in MPI. And once that's prioritized, then we proceed into the development of import health standards, and then trade can then commence once an IHS is approved or issued. Next slide. There have been recently some significant improvements into our import health development system. There are 4 that I have on the slide, but I'll just cover one, which will be of importance to our discussions today, which is on the import health standards. We used to, in the past, issue import health standards based on a country commodity basis. And now we have moved to a much more generic or commodity basis. And I give you an example. In the past, if Tonga requests for, say, Tahitian limes this morning, and in the afternoon, Fiji requests for Tahitian limes as well, because they are the same commodity, but they are from 2 different countries. They will each be considered 2 different projects. That's all. And, for each project, you need resources. That's why in the past, it took so long for us to actually issue import health standard, because of the approach that we used to take in the past, country commodity. But now, moving to a commodity generic approach, the same example, Tonga requested for Tahitian limes in the morning, and in the afternoon, Fiji, Tahitian limes as well, because they are the same commodity, irrespective of the country. The project will be one because of Tahitian limes. And then we do our analysis and assessment, and as countries become approved, as countries are assessed and they are given the okay, countries are then added to the list in the commodity IHS. So that is one of the changes, and that hopefully, in terms of the benefits, we should be able to see the more quick processing of import health standards in the future. Next slide, please. The next slide will be on the existing trade pathways into New Zealand. Most of us only know fresh produce. Yes, fresh produce is one of the pathways. We also have the frozen pathway. In the frozen pathway, we've realized that there has been a significant increase in the importation of frozen agricultural produce in the last 2, 3, or 4 years. Because, and this is also one of the recommendations we've always recommended to the countries, with fresh produce, there are biosecurity issues and concerns that you have to deal with. Whereas frozen pathway, the biosecurity risk is minimal, or it's nil at all. So it's much safer to ship to New Zealand frozen agricultural commodities compared to the fresh produce. And we also have the floriculture, handicrafts, processed products is also another pathway whereby it's also increasing. And we also have containers. Even containers is a pathway. And I'm saying that purely from the biosecurity perspective in terms of how biological risks are introduced into New Zealand. And irrespective of the pathway, you have both biosecurity requirements as well as food safety requirements that needs to be met for those pathways to be complied with. Next slide, please. Now, this is where we are. This is the Pacific in terms of our fresh produce IHSs. So the numbers on the top, those are the number of fresh produce IHSs that are approved from those countries. So the highest is Fiji, and it's not only the highest for the Pacific, it's the highest for the whole world as well. In terms of fresh produce, the Pacific, we lead the other countries from the rest of the world in the number of IHSs that's been approved. But even though you see those numbers that are there, it doesn't mean that that country, they are exporting all those commodities, which goes back to what I've mentioned earlier on. In the past, the Pacific, we have not really organized ourselves well in terms of prioritizing our requests and making sure that the product that we are requesting has a spot in the market. It's market driven, and it's also based on prioritization process in the countries. So those are the countries, and those are the numbers of commodities approved from those respective countries. Next slide, please. Challenge to the Pacific. This is, and it needs to be mentioned at this point. In the past, everybody just thinks that biosecurity is the only a concern. There are only the biosecurity concerns that needs to be taken into account. At the New Zealand border now, our clearance procedures, they cut across the supply chain management platform. And now, biosecurity, we also now have food safety systems in place. So that calls for a more holistic and a more coordinated approach in the exporting countries so that we are able to support the whole supply chain management. And I really like what was previously mentioned by Rohan. One of the things that we've realized as well in the past is that in addition to the lack of prioritization, getting the right information at the right time, well before you pick up your fork to go and dig your cassava mound to produce for the export market. It's getting the right information. Most of the investments and most of the projects have failed because we have not done the due process before we actually start, putting our plan into motion. Next slide, maybe. Won't go into detail because this is on the food safety slides, but this is for Mr. Camaivuna. So I've covered the biosecurity component of the presentation, and there are some established facts about some of the countries in the Pacific that will need to be further improved, maintained, and would need to be, there will need to be further investments of these are protected, especially with regards to the market here in New Zealand. Samoa, currently as we speak, we will be issuing the import health standards for citrus soon. Remember, we've moved away from a country commodity to now the generic, the big citrus IHS. Few of the Pacific countries will benefit from that. One of them is Samoa. While they have Tahitian limes that is currently approved, there will be other 7 species of citrus that are also included in this IHS that once approved. Samoa, you have 7 other species of citrus that you can also now export to New Zealand. And New Caledonia, they also have another fruit citrus species, the Mexican limes, that is now part of this new IHS. You already have your existing Tahitian limes, and the new will be Mexican limes. So you'll have Mexican limes added to that as well. And for Fiji, you also have 2 new access requests for citrus. You have Tahitian limes as well as Mare lemons. Tonga, you also have watermelon from Tonga that it's one of your priority commodities, and there has been a lot of improvement done in the pathway, and the pathway needs to be improved because it's one of your big commodity when it comes to export. And Fiji, likewise, you have few commodities that's only approved from Fiji and not from any other country in the world, like okra. Okra is not approved from any other country, and duruka as well. These are high value crops, of high value commodities in the market. Duruka is not imported from any other country, and there are other opportunities like pineapple. For our information, pineapple is the next IHS project that MPI will be working on, and there are already few Pacific Island countries that have submitted their request for new new IHS for pineapple. I'll stop here now, and through you, Madam Trade Commissioner, if we could move on to the food safety presentation for Mr. Camaivuna. Thank you again.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Nazar. Always a pleasure to have you join us and impart your wisdom, some very, very valuable concepts and information in your presentation. We'll come back to you after Alipate's presentation, because the questions that are arising, I think we could put to the both of you from MPI. So Alipate, welcome. Very pleased to have you join us this morning, and we look forward to hearing from you. So the floor is yours, Vinaka.
Welcome, Madam Commissioner. Naganatha. Again, by way of introduction quickly, I am Alipate and I work in the Food Safety Division of MPI. In particular, I work in the Approvals team, which, as the name suggests, is the approval or registration arm of the ministry, particularly when it comes to things associated with food safety. So, in essence, my team registered all food businesses in collaboration with the local councils here in New Zealand. We are the sole registration authority for all animal products businesses, including all exporters of animal products and all importers of food. So I'll be covering the food safety aspect of importing food into New Zealand, and in particular in relation to how our food safety system is set up.
Alipate, if I may, I just
Yep.
Sorry, it's Glenys here. So just for the benefit of the listeners, to point out that when we say food safety, it's very inclusive, isn't it? Across all food products. So it relates to, so we just need to make this distinction.
Yep, that is correct. Yes, so that is all food for human consumption.
For human, whether it's irrespective of the manufacturer so fresh, frozen, processed.
Yep. Everything that is intended for human consumption, that's what we're referring to when we talk about food safety.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alipate.
Thank you. So I'll start off with the law that established our food safety system. So there are effectively 3 tiers of the law that set up New Zealand's food safety system. And right at the top, you'll have our Food Act, which imposes a general obligation on anybody that trades in food to make sure that the food is safe and suitable. So that obligation applies to food importers as well. So the other part of the Food Act is for the purpose of facilitating trade. And under that, as you'll all be aware, we have obligations under various international agreements and treaties that we have to abide by when we're setting our importing rules. And under the Food Act, that's where the requirement for all food importers to be registered comes from. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail later on. And then under the Food Act, you have the Food Regulations 2015. So that goes into a little bit more detail about certain things relating to import, in particular, how we categorize imported food depending on risk for the purpose of clearance at the border, and the verification frequencies for all food businesses and food importers. And then the third tier down, it gets more technical. That's when you talk about the food types that are subject to intervention at the border, where the importer will be required to provide evidence before the food safety officer can grant them with clearance. And then, of course, we have the Food Standards Code, which we share with Australia. So that particular code largely deals with the labeling requirements that Rohan talked about earlier on, and the compositional requirements for food. Now, if we jump onto the next slide, please. Then, of course, in addition to our domestic platform, we have our international obligations. You'd see there we have the SPS agreement. That one is very important to us when we're setting up importing rules, because of the principles under that agreement. We have to make sure that the importing rules that we put in place are science-based, and they are, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later on. They have to be proportional to the risks associated with the food. They have to be transparent, and the rules we set have to be non-discriminatory, as most of you may know that we have the concept of most favored nation approach, which is effectively the approach that whatever rules you set for your most favored country, you must set it for the rest. And then, of course, in all situations, you have to be aiming towards equivalence. Effectively, the position that what is acceptable in one country is acceptable to us. But that's easier said than done, because most of the time things are not equivalent. That's why we carry on extra assessment and put in place extra intervention measures to make sure that food that is coming in is safe for our population. And as Nadar said earlier on, we also have the Codex standards there. So every time we set our food safety standards, whether that be in relation to food imports or any other general standard that we set, we always have Codex standard in mind. We can either, we have the ability to adopt specific standards if we want to, but most of the time we try and tailor our standards specifically to the risks profile of things that are coming in relation to New Zealand and go from there. And then we have the Trans-Tasman Mutual Recognition Agreement. We have a very special relationship with Australia. So the principle under that agreement is effectively anything that is allowed to be legally sold in Australia can be sold here in New Zealand with minimal to no intervention, and vice versa. And then you have other bilateral agreements sitting underneath that. Next slide, please. So I'll start off with the question of who can import food into New Zealand. As Rohan touched on a little bit earlier, only registered importers can import food into New Zealand. It might be of interest to you to know that as of the 1st of August, we've done hard enforcement of this in collaboration with New Zealand Customs. So therefore, from that date, if a consignment is coming into New Zealand and the importer is not registered, and then that consignment will be held up until registration is achieved, and any associated cost with regards to the holding up of the consignment, it's transferred to a warehouse or storehouse to be stored in the meantime, or that associated costs with the holding up of the consignment will be borne by the importer. So please be aware of that and make sure that before you arrange for the importation of your product into New Zealand, that your import agent on this side is a registered importer. And also a person who is not a registered importer may use an agent who is registered. So that provision in our legislation is normally there for people like customs brokers who don't actually have ownership of the product, but they facilitate the clearance requirements. So they handle the customs clearance side of things. So if they are registered, then they can be used without the person using them having to be registered. And registration is done by MPI, in particular my team, and the registration process is done in collaboration with customs. So there are details on how this may be done, including the forms on the MPI website. So you have to go to customs first to get your customs client code, and after that they'll direct you to MPI with the appropriate application form, in which case your application will come through to my team, and then we'll process your application before approving it. There are, of course, criteria to importer registrations. There'll be, a check on your compliance history, a check on your character, just a general, effectively like a police clearance check to make sure there's nothing there that triggers an alarm with regards to whether you're appropriate. Looking at past convictions, if any, and things like that. Once all of that are cleared up, then we register a person as an importer. And once you're registered, there are duties under the Act for you to comply with. So this is more about the duties. So this includes, it's your responsibility to confirm the safety and the suitability of the food if you're an importer. This involves doing your due diligence and making sure that you have proper documentation from your supplier overseas. So when we check with the food importer over this side, we expect them to provide us with with details about who they're sourcing it from, which country, what sort of safety mechanisms or considerations they've gone through, manufacturer's declarations where required, and those other kind of documentation that they are expected to keep as part of their duties as an importer. We also place quite an emphasis on the ability to recall. So all food importers must have a recall procedure in place, and they must also test it to make sure that it's fit for purpose when it's needed. They can put it in action and prove that it's effective. There you go. So one of the challenges that we sort of consider right at the beginning is how do we decide which food we target at the border and which food we allow through without any intervention, because of the enormous volumes of food coming into New Zealand, because we're a trading country. You don't want to be checking absolutely everything. You want to be mindful of the fact that you have biosecurity checks with IHSs. Those are quite comprehensive. We don't want to be doubling up and duplicating the process, imposing costs and time to operators, as well as our own costs and time. So we want to simplify and streamline the process as much as possible. So to a large degree, we sort of piggyback on the food safety side. We sort of piggyback on the biosecurity side of things. In most situations, the biosecurity requirements would be sufficient and food safety requirements won't be needed, but it's only in exceptional circumstances where there'd be extra food safety requirements for you to meet in terms of border clearance. So this slide here addresses how we categorize food in order to decide which one we target specifically at the border and which one can come straight through. So with our international obligation in mind, I talked about the principle of the SPS agreement before with regards to make sure that our requirements are science-based. So our legislation specifically say that we have to apply a science-based approach when we're making our categorization. So we have to give a due consideration to the risks to human health posed by the food in relation to its nature, the hazard associated with the food, the control measures that are applied during processing and handling of the food, the likelihood of the particular hazard being present in the food at a level determined as unacceptable in New Zealand according to New Zealand or international standard, and the likelihood that the food is not safe or suitable. So those are the considerations that we go through when we're categorizing the food. And these are the three general categories of food, which determines which one we test at the border coming in and which one we don't. So the very high risk food, we categorize them as high regulatory interest food or HRI food. These are foods, as the description shows there, they pose an increased risk to health of consumers and requires clearance for entry. And then next to that, you have increased regulatory interest food. Some countries, they call them surveillance food. It is a high risk food where there's still a lot of question mark about them. So you want to keep them under surveillance, but you want to put in place controls to make sure that you are protecting the health of the public in terms of managing the risks at the border before entry is granted. And then the third category down, which are the low regulatory interest food, or LRI. So the overwhelming majority of food imported into New Zealand categorized as low regulatory interest food. And as I said before, only HRI and IRI foods require clearance at the border by a New Zealand food safety officer before it can be cleared into New Zealand. So currently, as I said, there are about 13 high regulatory interest foods and one increased regulatory interest food identified in the importing food notice, which is the notice available on the MPR website that sets out the different food types that requires a check at the border from a food safety perspective. And that check would be additional to any biosecurity check that might already be there. So the one increased regulatory interest food are frozen berries, That was been on that list since 2013, if I remember correctly, after an outbreak of hepatitis A in frozen berries imported from China and Thailand, if I remember correctly. So if you look at that particular notice, so for each one of those 13 high regulatory interest food, there you'd see the name of the food, the sort of hazard that we're concerned about, the type of check that is applied to them, and the sort of evidence that the importer will have to provide to the food safety officer to consider before the food can be released. So for bovine meat and meat products in particular, we check for BSE, peanuts and pistachio nuts, check for aflatoxins, frozen berries, as I said before, hepatitis A, raw milk products, Listeria mono and Salmonella, and then when histamine for histamine susceptible fish and fish products. And as I said before, majority of food imported are flow interest, so they come straight through. So one of the things that we do a lot of thinking about internally in MPI as well is what sort of evidence would be enough for the importer to provide us before we can grant clearance. So our general approach is to emphasize control where it's most effective to do so. To a larger degree, we want the risks to be managed where the food is produced or processed. So therefore, in pre-border, before it comes to New Zealand, so we always want to push the focus back to where the food was produced in the home country, and do country approval. And then with regards to that, the output might be some sort of agreed certification where we agree that we've checked your system and it is acceptable, and therefore we'll accept a official certificate from you that effectively confirm that the producer or processor was operating within the agreed scheme and the product is indeed the outcome of that scheme. So therefore, once that certificate is provided, the product can come straight through. But for some countries, and also due to the nature of the product, that might not be practical, and sampling and testing might still be required, where the foods arrive at the border and it's sampled and tested for the specific hazards that I mentioned before. And the result of that, the result of the testing will decide whether the product is released into New Zealand or not. And then also we have the New Zealand Importer Assurance or Trusted Importer System. So this is for importers with good compliance history. So after a consecutive test of the food that they're bringing into the country, if they're bringing in the same thing and they provide really good, consistent level of compliance, and they can skip tests for certain periods of time.
Alipate, sorry,
Yep.
I'm just conscious of the time, and I'm just wondering whether it would be possible for you to go through the slides in the next few minutes to conclude, because I can see some really valuable questions coming through.
Yep.
And
all right, we can skip this slide over here. Thank you.
Okay.
Integration into domestic system. Yes, this one is simple. So once the food is imported into New Zealand, then it's transitioned into the New Zealand domestic system and managed from there. So every food business in New Zealand, they are registered with either MPI or the council, and they all operate under the HACCP-based risk management program. So once the food is imported into New Zealand and the New Zealand business gets it, they manage it according to that HACCP-based program. Yeah. So we make sure that food importers can be subject to verification. So there are effectively two categories of importers here. So you have importers that also sell food in New Zealand. So they all belong in that category that I explained before. They'll already be operating under a HACCP-based risk management system in New Zealand. So their verification will just be the normal verification that they're subject to under that system. And then you have importers that only import but don't sell here. For example, customs brokers. For those guys, they are not subject to any verification, but they can be required to be verified if there are compliance issues. So these types of regulated people are required to be approved or recognized by MPI. So first of all food safety officers that carry out food clearance at the border or clearing consignments, they have to be approved by MPI first. All recognized verification agencies and persons who carry out verification, they have to be recognized by MPI before they can do that. And also all laboratories that carry out tests for regulatory purposes, we approve them as well. And we have this big safety net called a monitoring program. So our law allows MPI to set up monitoring programs to monitor how the food safety system is functioning. If we're concerned about a particular food product imported or produced domestically, we can put in place a monitoring program to go and require producers to provide samples so we can test them for certain hazards if we're concerned about those things. So we can do that. One example that I put there was the Fukushima example, the nuclear leak in Japan. So you see there was a monitoring program put in place to test fish species from around the New Zealand coast, some samples of fish from New Zealand supermarket, and some sample of imported fish from Japan and fish caught in the Northern Pacific region. So yeah, so effectively the outcome of that program was that our testing revealed there was no risk to the New Zealand consumers. Mm-hmm. Yep, and that's effectively this diagram here sort of sums up what I was talking about before. You have to be registered as an importer, comply with your duty, be aware of the category in which your food falls into, because that will determine whether they are targeted at the border here or not. Remember that from the 1st of August, we've put in hard enforcement. If the consignment is not being imported by a person who is registered, it will be held up. And then, as I've explained, we have different evidence that we require importers to provide for different high regulatory interest food or increased regulatory interest food that they're bringing into the country. Yep, that's me. Thank you. That concludes my presentation today.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Alipate, and thank you, Natha. While I have you, I think it would be useful at this point to just put to you some of the questions that are coming through, if you don't mind. So one of them is around registered importers, and I heard this phrase being repeated through your presentations. Does this, the importance of having registered importers or registered agents recognized by MPI, does this apply for food coming into the formal market and informal market, or just into the formal market? Now, the question is coming from the standpoint that, as we know, here in New Zealand, a lot of exports from the Pacific Island countries are targeting the diaspora, here in Auckland and across New Zealand. And so I guess the question is in relation to that. So does it apply?
It depends on the purpose for which the food is being imported. If it's imported for the purpose of sale, then the importer must be registered.
So even to clear it at the border, let's just break that up a little bit. So for the informal market, we notice that a lot of the containers that are coming in for the informal market are purely for consumption, and some of it is for sale. So we do know that communities resell it. So what happens in that case?
If it's going to be sold, like including reselling the food, then the importer needs to be registered. Yeah.
Okay.
So prior to the 1st of August, it was sort of like a bit of a lax in terms of enforcement. But from the 1st of August, a policy decision was made that we're going to enforce the registration requirement where every food consignment imported for sale into New Zealand, the importer has to be registered. Otherwise, it'll be held up.
All right. Can you just please, Alipate, go to your slide that highlighted the 3 risks, or the 3 types of risks?
Categories of food.
Yes. Put up on the screen, Ivy, please.
just while she's putting that up, right now as we speak, we've got about 3,138 registered importers that have registered with us so far.
Okay. Ivy, are you there? Can you just put Alipate's presentation back on the screen, particularly the slide that talks about the risks? And while Ivy's doing that, the question that's come through is looking at those risks and the classification of those risks, as you pointed out, Alipate, and taking into account Nava's presentation where he highlighted the number of approved, assessed commodities across the Pacific Island countries, and there was a scale of those numbers. So you have on one hand a list of approved commodities from Pacific Island countries, and then you have on another hand the so-called risk assessment, the risk assessment that your department applies. How then do you put that, the layer of the Pacific layer over this application of clearance? So the clearance processes, how do you put a Pacific lens on that, noting that this is a generic and applies to every single global importer into New Zealand? I'm just kind of bringing it down to the Pacific context and wondering how it applies, or where you seeing that conversion, for Pacific products coming in.
Okay.
So the question is to both Alipate and Nava.
Okay.
Brilliant.
So from our perspective, not all type of imported food would require a risk assessment. So we look at Natha's side for each type of food being imported into New Zealand. If we are satisfied that everything is being addressed there, we won't require any further risk assessment most of the time. So the only sort of food types that we've imposed extra requirements on were those 13 specific food types that we've listed on the on our importing food notice that is available on the MPI website. Yeah, so those are the only ones that are extra to the biosecurity side of things from Nava's side. Yeah. So most of those fresh produce stuff, there is no requirement on the food safety side of things, just from the biosecurity side. Yeah. So on the food safety side, if you look in there, it's just mainly beef, raw milk. You have nuts and fish susceptible to histamine, and frozen berries. Yeah, mainly along that category. Okay.
So again, when you put a Pacific lens on that, what you just said, a lot of what's coming in from the Pacific is you got fish and your frozen and fresh produce, right? So it's important to make those distinctions. And the other question that has come through is we talked a lot about in both your presentations around the food imports and the security measures that are necessary. What about for non-food products? And probably Nava, this question is directed to you. There's a question specific to garments. I know this is probably outside of the presentation, but while we have you, Nava, online, maybe you could offer some words of wisdom as to those small businesses in the Pacific whose manufacturing and exports are garment-centric, not food.
Thank you, Trade Commissioner. With garments, we go through a profiling at the border. Okay, so our target evaluators, they are the ones who do the evaluation. Even though garment can be considered a non-agricultural item, but if there are reasons that would justify for us to inspect a consignment, then we will do that. Now, we also need to know that we have it's called the joint border arrangement. If a consignment is considered non-agricultural, but is being inspected by customs, and then during the inspection, they pick up that there is a pest that was detected on the consignment. So they are also, they have that, we have that arrangement. that they will have to close the container and make that reference to us. So some of those commodities, some of those items that are not considered agricultural commodities that that are being picked up by customs. So I think in terms of advice with those with regards to those non-agricultural commodities, some of the exporters, they have what is called they have their own treatment system. For example, like garments, maybe they pack their garments and then maybe treat the container just before they sail with methyl bromide to ensure that they kill any pest that's there in the container, because they can be packed in, maybe at the back of the house or wherever they will be packed. That does not stop the pests from entering the container, the hitchhikers. But having those systems in place, like a treatment protocol, would help to manage those. Otherwise, they can be picked up at the border, not necessarily by us, can be picked up by customs or other officers who will be there, like security, who can also pick that up for us.
I think that's very, very, very clear. We have quite a few questions to you both, but I'll think it might be best that we address them at the end of the day, noting that we have two more presenters lined up and waiting to come into the room. But just the last question on the focal point. So what would be your advice to those listening as to who their focal points are in country? Who should they go to at the national level to access and to seek more information or advice on the points that you've raised around food security and biosecurity?
Thank you, Trade Commissioner. You've raised a very important point. The focal point for biosecurity in the countries are their biosecurity head office. So the head of biosecurity in the countries, they are our focal point. So every discussion that we have with the countries is done through the focal point. So we cannot engage with anyone else in the country but through the focal point. And that's where every interested trader, that's where they get the information from. Put it this way, we are New Zealand, we are the regulatory authority in New Zealand. We cannot be in Samoa, we cannot be in Fiji to make sure that our requirements are met. So that's why we have the biosecurity authorities in those countries. They are our equivalent. And when it comes to facilitating trade for export to New Zealand, for example, they are there to ensure that our requirements, that's when they put the New Zealand cap on and make sure that our requirements are actually met. This is a very important point. And just to add on to that, Trade Commissioner, the discussions we've been having today, as I've mentioned, there's a shift as well. Like in the past, traders are only interested about biosecurity requirements. No. Now you need to find out what's the biosecurity requirement, what is also the food safety requirements. Some commodities are approved under the biosecurity discipline, but they have issues with regards to the food safety. A good example is fresh mussels from Fiji or from anywhere. Fresh kai, we can approve that. It's approved under the biosecurity system, but under the food safety system, they have concerns on that. So I think they're just reiterating the point, Trade Commissioner. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Nanda. And I'm sorry we're running into against time. I wish we had more time this afternoon to keep you online because the questions are coming through, and I think the listeners will agree that this is a really critical area to exporters, and they really, really need to understand what it is that they're dealing with if they're trying to get their exports or their products into New Zealand. So I'm going to just ask you to stay online for a little bit more, if you don't mind, as we line up two more presenters who are time bound. I do apologize to Anthony and Jay, but I will take this opportunity to again thank you, Nada. Thank you, Alipate. Please stay online, and we'll come back to you at the end of the day.